The mansion was suffocating in silence. The quiet chaos erupted as Isabella knelt beside the lifeless body of the young boy, her hands shaking violently, holding something grotesque in her palm. It was dark, wet, and alive. She had never seen anything like it before. The butler's voice cracked as he spoke, panic seeping through his words. "Isabella, what have you done?" Footsteps thundered through the halls, frantic and furious. Maximus Storm, the billionaire whose empire stretched across continents, rushed into the room. His face drained of color as he stared at his motionless son. "What happened to my son?" he shouted, his voice split in the air like a storm, thick with both rage and fear. Isabella looked up, her tears blurring her vision. She whispered, "I didn't hurt him, sir. I swear, I was only trying to help him." "Help?" Maximus's voice dropped dangerously low. "You went near him without my permission." Her hands trembled as she slowly opened her palm, revealing the grotesque, squirming thing that had been trapped in the boy's ear for years. The room froze. Everyone stepped back, repelled by the sight of the creature, now exposed. And then a sound, a soft, fragile whisper, broke the silence. The boy, Sebastian, a child who had never uttered a single word in his life, finally spoke. "Dad." His voice was weak but clear, too loud, everything too loud. The room stood frozen, every single person stunned by the impossible. Maximus Storm sank to his knees before his son, his heart breaking and soaring in the same moment. The impossible had just happened. Maximus Storm had everything a man could ever want: wealth, power, and an empire that stretched across continents. His name was revered in the boardrooms of every major city, and his business acumen was admired worldwide. Yet, in the one place where he should have felt the most in control, his own home, he was powerless. His son, Sebastian, was born deaf, and despite all of Maximus's efforts and resources, nothing had been able to fix the void of silence that surrounded his boy. Sebastian's world was one of stillness, a place where sound didn't exist. The boy never laughed, never cried, never said a word. Maximus had consulted the best doctors, flown specialists in from across the globe, and spent millions trying to find a solution, but nothing worked. The guilt ate at him daily. He'd spent so much of his life building his empire, but when it came to the most important thing, the life of his son, he felt utterly helpless. At night, while his colleagues celebrated victories, Maximus would often stand in the doorway of Sebastian's room, watching his son sleep. There was a part of him that longed to hear the sound of his son's voice, to hear him laugh or cry. He would see the boy's fragile, silent figure in the bed and wonder, what dreams did a child who couldn't hear lullabies have? Would his son ever feel the joy of the world he created for him? Every failed attempt to help Sebastian only added to the weight of guilt that Maximus carried. He questioned himself constantly. Could he have done more? Had he failed as a father by focusing too much on work? Could he have been more present, more nurturing during the pregnancy? The questions tormented him at night, each one gnawing at his soul like a cancer he could never get rid of. It was on a crisp spring morning when Isabella entered the Storm mansion for the first time. The grand, imposing structure could have overwhelmed anyone, but not Isabella. She had been shaped by hardship, by the weight of her family struggles. She was desperate, and she wasn't about to let anything stop her from earning her place. A 26-year-old woman with deep brown eyes, she had seen pain in her own life, the kind of pain that didn't let you rest. Isabella had grown up in a small apartment with her mother and younger brother. Samuel, her brother, was born healthy, but when he turned 4, a cruel illness stole his hearing. Their family couldn't afford treatment, and despite promises from doctors, nothing changed. Samuel's silence grew deeper, and 2 years later, he died at the tender age of 6. The pain never left Isabella. The weight of her brother's death was something that followed her everywhere. It wasn't just a loss. It was a helplessness of watching him suffer without being able to fix it. As she stood by his grave, she made a vow. If I ever meet another child suffering like you did, I won't look away. I won't let money decide if they deserve help. This vow drove her, and it was the reason she applied for the job at the Storm Mansion, even though she knew it wouldn't be easy. The head housekeeper, Mrs. Latham, eyed her with suspicion when she arrived. Isabella didn't look like someone who belonged in a mansion like this. But Isabella had learned to hide her past, to mask the pain and desperation she carried. This job was a chance for something better. Mr. Storm doesn't tolerate mistakes, Mrs. Latham warned her, her voice cold. You follow the rules and you stay. Break them and you're gone. I understand, Isabella replied quietly, meeting her gaze with determination. I won't disappoint you. The first time Isabella saw Sebastian, he was sitting on a grand staircase, arranging toy cars with meticulous precision. Red, blue, yellow, green. It was like watching an artist at work. But there was an underlying loneliness in his movements. The silence around him seemed to press down on the space, thick and palpable. Isabella stopped for a moment, watching him. There was something about the way he moved, careful, isolated. It was as if the boy was trying to make the world around him fit into something he could control, something he could understand. Sebastian didn't notice her at first. He was too absorbed in his task, lining up the cars, perfectly aligned, each one in its place. Isabella stepped closer, feeling the weight of the silence settle around them. She saw his dark eyes, large and serious, and her heart twisted. There was so much behind those eyes, so much pain that no one had ever helped him carry. She wasn't sure what drew her in more, the child's isolation or the deep, aching sense of loneliness in his heart that mirrored her own. Over time, she began to leave small tokens for him. Smooth river stones, pieces of chocolate wrapped in silver paper. At first, he ignored them. She wondered if he even noticed. But then one day, the chocolate was gone. In its place, there was an origami crane. Isabella smiled to herself, her heart fluttering. He noticed. Days passed, and their silent connection deepened. Isabella started teaching him simple signs, things that could help him communicate. At first, he barely responded. But then one day, he signed back, asking for more. It was small progress, but to Isabella, it felt like a monumental shift. She was starting to break down the walls of his silent world, and she could see the beginnings of a bond that transcended words. But every day, Isabella noticed the pain that lingered on Sebastian's face. He would press his small hand to his ear, wincing in discomfort, as if the very air around him was too much to bear. There was a physicality to his silence now, something that made Isabella's heart ache. She couldn't ignore it any longer. One evening, as they sat alone in the garden, her heart pounding with fear, Isabella finally saw it. The dark, glistening creature buried deep inside his ear. It was alive, and it had been there for years, hidden, festering, unnoticed. Isabella's heart stopped as she realized the depth of the betrayal. Someone who was supposed to care for him, had ignored this pain for years. Isabella's heart raced as she stared at the creature, squirming in the depths of Sebastian's ear. Her mind was a storm, her thoughts spinning with the weight of the decision she had to make. She had spent days agonizing over what to do, and now, in this quiet garden, it all came to a head. The pain in Sebastian's eyes, the constant discomfort, the silent screams that no one had heard. It was too much. She couldn't turn away, not this time. Her own past, the painful memories of her brother Samuel's suffering, clouded her vision. She had lived with the crushing weight of regret for years, knowing that she couldn't help Samuel when he needed her most. But now, here was another child in pain, another life that needed saving. Isabella's fingers trembled as she gently reached out to touch Sebastian's ear. She knew that touching him would mean defying Maximus's strict orders, breaking the trust of the man who had given her a job, the man whose wealth and power kept her in line. But it didn't matter. All that mattered was a child in front of her, suffering in silence. Isabella whispered to herself, "I made a promise to you, Samuel. I won't fail him." Maximus had to know. He had to see what she had found. But how could she tell him? He was a man who ran a multi-billion-dollar empire, a man who controlled everything around him with the stroke of a pen. What would he think of her, a mere maid, bringing such news? What would he do when he discovered that the doctors he trusted had failed his son so miserably? She didn't know, but she couldn't ignore this. She had to act. That night, lying in her bed, Isabella couldn't sleep. The darkness of the room seemed to press in on her, thick with the weight of what she had seen. She closed her eyes and whispered into the night, "Samuel, what do I do?" Her heart answered her before her mind could. She had to go to Maximus. She had to expose the truth, no matter the cost. And so, in the quiet hours before dawn, Isabella made her decision. She would confront Maximus Storm, not just as a maid, but as a woman who had seen the truth and couldn't turn away. The morning light crept through the curtains, casting soft, golden beams across the mansion's grand foyer. Isabella moved silently, her footsteps barely making a sound on the marble floors. She felt the weight of her decision pressing on her chest, the uncertainty of the unknown coiling around her like a tight knot. But there was no turning back now. When she reached Sebastian's room, the door was slightly ajar. She pushed it open, her heart thudding painfully in her chest. Inside, Sebastian sat on the floor, his small hands clutching his ears, his face contorted in pain. The agony was visible, and it shattered something deep inside Isabella. She moved quickly to his side, kneeling down beside him. His eyes, normally so bright and full of curiosity, were dull with exhaustion. The sound of his labored breathing filled the room, each gasp of air heavy with the weight of his suffering. Isabella's fingers brushed gently against his hand, and he looked up at her with pleading eyes. Hurts, he signed frantically, his small fingers trembling. "I know. Sebastian," Isabella whispered, her voice trembling as she spoke. "Let me help you." Her heart clenched as she carefully reached toward his ear, the one that had been causing him so much pain. She had no idea what she would find, no idea how bad it had gotten. But the moment she touched the side of his head, her breath caught in her throat. The creature was there, alive, writhing, its dark, grotesque form nestled deep within his ear. Isabella's hand shook as she pulled away, her mind racing with shock and disbelief. How could this have happened? How could no one have seen this? How could a child suffer for so long and not be given the care he desperately needed? This was no accident. This was negligence. This was betrayal. Maximus needed to know. Isabella had no choice but to confront him, to make him see what had been hidden from him. But how could she possibly explain this? How could she tell him that the doctors he trusted, the ones he paid to care for his son, had failed him so utterly? The thoughts swirled in her mind like a whirlwind, but the moment was too pressing to delay. She couldn't wait any longer. Isabella rose to her feet, determined. "I'll get help," she promised Sebastian, her voice firm with the weight of her decision. She ran to the door, her heart pounding. The confrontation would come, whether she was ready for it or not. Maximus Storm stood in the doorway of Sebastian's room, his gaze cold and sharp. The silence between them was thick, as if the air itself was holding its breath. Isabella's heart raced in her chest, her palms slick with nervous sweat. She hadn't expected him to come in so quickly, but here he was, his presence towering over her. "What are you doing to my son?" Maximus's voice was a low growl, laced with fear he rarely allowed anyone to see. Isabella froze, Her body tense as she faced him. She could feel his anger radiating toward her like heat from a fire. But she couldn't back down now, not when she knew the truth. "I was trying to help him," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "I found something in his ear, something that's been there for years." Maximus's eyes narrowed, disbelief flickering across his face. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, stepping closer to Sebastian's bed. His gaze flicked to his son, who was still clutching his ear, his small body shaking with discomfort. Isabella opened her palm slowly, revealing the grotesque creature that had been lodged inside Sebastian's ear for years. It squirmed dark and wet, its form still alive despite its years of concealment. Maximus took a step back, his face draining of color as he processed what he was seeing. The room seemed to go still. The only sound was the soft, labored breathing of Sebastian. And then, as if the universe itself had conspired to make the moment even more impossible, Sebastian spoke. His voice, raw and unsure, broke through the silence. "Dad, too loud," he whispered. Maximus collapsed to his knees beside his son, his hands trembling as he reached for him. Tears filled his eyes as he pulled his son into an embrace, his mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. The impossible had just occurred. Sebastian had spoken. For the first time in his life, he had broken his silence. But as Maximus looked up at Isabella, a dark realization began to set in. He had trusted the best doctors. He had spent millions, yet none of them had seen the creature that had been hiding in his son's ear. Had they failed him, or was it something more? Isabella's heart broke as she saw the truth unfold before her eyes. This wasn't just about fixing Sebastian's hearing. This was about exposing a system of care that had failed him, that had failed them all. The following days felt like a blur to Isabella. What she had uncovered had sent shockwaves through the entire Storm estate. The discovery of the creature in Sebastian's ear had only been the beginning. Now, Isabella was caught in a whirlwind of confusion, fear, and rage as she stood side by side with Maximus, trying to navigate the storm that had erupted around them. Maximus's once pristine world had fractured. The reality of the medical negligence was far worse than he had ever imagined. The doctors, the specialists, the countless medical professionals he had trusted, all of them had overlooked the simplest truth. Sebastian's deafness had been caused by a foreign object, hidden and left untreated for years. The thought of it made Maximus feel sick to his stomach. How could he have been so blind? Maximus Storm, the man who commanded attention in every room, who made billion-dollar decisions on a daily basis, now found himself fighting for something he never thought he would have to, his son's life. But as the days wore on, the full extent of betrayal began to sink in. Isabella, the maid who had been there for less than a month, was now the one who had saved his son. She, the woman who had nothing, had done more for his family than all his money, his empire, and his reputation ever had. He couldn't help but wonder, as they worked together to uncover the truth, if he'd been blinded by his own arrogance, believing that wealth could solve everything. But with the truth came more questions. Who had known about the neglect? How deep did corruption go? Maximus couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that the medical industry was hiding something far darker than they had been led to believe. The tension between them grew with every passing moment. Maximus's guilt weighed heavy on his chest, but as much as he wanted to fix everything with money, Isabella remained resolute. She wasn't interested in his wealth or his influence. She had her own mission, to make sure Sebastian was never abandoned again. One evening, as the two of them sat alone in the study, Isabella turned to him. Her voice was soft but full of determination. "The system is broken. You know that, don't you?" Maximus looked at her, his eyes full of unspoken regret. "I do now," he murmured, his voice strained. "I can't believe I didn't see it. I should have done more." His fingers gripped the edge of the desk, as if holding on to something to keep him grounded. Isabella stood, walking toward the window, her eyes scanning the grounds below. It's not just the doctors, Maximus. It's the whole system, the entire healthcare industry. They'll do anything to keep the truth hidden. Maximus rose from his chair, walking to stand beside her. He could feel the weight of her words pressing down on him. She was right. They had to expose the truth, no matter the cost. But how could they do it? The doctors had covered their tracks too well. The more they dug, the more they realized the extent of conspiracy. "What do we do now?" he asked, his voice raw with frustration. Isabella's gaze shifted to meet his. "We go public. We take this to the press. We make them answer for what they did." Her tone was unwavering. Maximus's heart raced. The idea of facing the media, of opening up their private lives to the world, was terrifying. But Isabella was right. They couldn't let this go. Not after everything they had uncovered. Not after the years Sebastian had suffered in silence. The decision had been made. Isabella and Maximus would go to the media. It was the only way to ensure that Sebastian's suffering had not been in vain. They needed to expose the corruption within the healthcare system, to shed light on the medical malpractice that had stolen his voice for so long. The night before the press conference, Isabella and Maximus sat together, the weight of the world on their shoulders. Sebastian, who had been through so much already, was in his room, finally resting. His condition had improved drastically since Isabella's intervention, but the road to recovery would be long. Maximus sat beside Isabella, his heart heavy with the knowledge that the next day would change everything. It wasn't just about saving his son anymore. It was about doing what was right, exposing the greed and corruption that had nearly destroyed their family. "I never thought it would come to this," Maximus said, his voice thick with emotion. "I always thought money could fix everything, but I was wrong." Isabella turned to him, her eyes filled with understanding. "Sometimes it takes something bigger than money to fix the broken things inside of us." She was right. Maximus knew this now. He had been so consumed by his empire, by his power, that he neglected the most important thing in his life, his family. He had spent years trying to buy solutions, trying to buy love. But love wasn't for sale. Love, trust, and sacrifice, those were the things that mattered. The next morning, they stood before the cameras, a new chapter in their lives beginning. Maximus, standing beside Isabella, spoke with clarity and conviction. "For years, I've allowed my wealth to blind me," he began, his voice carrying through the room. "But I am here today to expose the truth. My son, Sebastian, was a victim of medical malpractice, and the healthcare system failed him. They failed us. And now, we will make sure no one else has to suffer in silence." The room fell silent as the weight of his words hit the press. Isabella stood beside him, unwavering. She had made the decision to stand by Sebastian and Maximus, no matter the consequences. Together, they would fight for justice. The press conference was only the beginning. As the weeks passed, the storm that had erupted around Maximus and Isabella became an unstoppable force. The public's reaction was one of disbelief, anger, and a thirst for justice. The media coverage was overwhelming, and soon the story had spread far beyond the boundaries of their quiet mansion. But with the attention came a new set of challenges. Maximus's empire, built on years of hard work and millions of dollars, was now facing legal battles, accusations, and scrutiny. The very foundation of his success was being questioned, but he stood tall, never faltering in his resolve. For the first time in years, he knew what he was fighting for. Isabella, too, was tested. She had gone from being a humble maid to one of the most public figures in the media, a symbol of courage, compassion, and moral integrity. She had never sought fame or recognition. Her mission was always simple, to help those who had been overlooked and neglected. But now, she found herself in a world that was constantly watching constantly judging. Maximus watched her closely, admiring her strength. In the midst of the chaos, Isabella had become his anchor. She was the one who kept him grounded, who reminded him that everything they were doing was for the right reasons. One evening, after a particularly grueling day filled with legal paperwork, phone calls, and endless media interviews, Maximus and Isabella found themselves alone in the mansion's garden. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a soft light on the flowers and the stone paths beneath their feet. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with unspoken understanding. Maximus reached out, gently taking Isabella's hand in his. "I never expected any of this," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "I didn't know it would be this hard, but I know now it's all worth it." Isabella turned to him, her eyes soft but intense. She knew that Maximus's transformation wasn't just about the fight for Sebastian's health. It was about the fight for their shared future. He was no longer the man who saw money as the answer to everything. The man standing before her now was someone she could respect. "I've seen you change, Maximus," she said softly. "And it's more than just what you've done for Sebastian. It's what you've done for yourself. I see the man you really are now, the one who's ready to fight for what's right, not just what's easy." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. In that moment, they both knew that their journey wasn't over. They had just begun to rebuild what had been broken. The man they were now was someone new, a man who had learned the value of love, of sacrifice, of trust, a man who had once been too proud to see the truth, but who now understood that the greatest strength came from vulnerability. "I'll never be the same again," Maximus replied, his gaze never leaving hers. "I've learned that wealth, power, none of it matters unless you have someone to share it with, someone who will stand by you, even when everything else falls apart, someone who can see the truth even when you're blinded by your own success." As the weeks turned into months, Maximus and Isabella's bond grew deeper. Their relationship had blossomed into something far more profound than either had anticipated. In the early days of their partnership, Maximus had been driven by guilt, seeking redemption for his past mistakes. But as he spent more time with Isabella, something shifted inside him. She wasn't just a maid, a woman who had helped save his son's life. She had become the one person he could truly rely on, the one person who saw through his layers of wealth and power and saw him for who he really was. Their love wasn't rushed or impulsive. It was a slow burn, a connection forged in the fires of adversity. It wasn't about passion alone. It was about understanding, trust, and mutual respect. They had both been through so much, and together, they found solace in each other's arms. But it wasn't just the romantic aspect of their relationship that flourished. Maximus had learned the true value of family. Sebastian's recovery was the emotional center of their journey. But as the boy continued to heal, it became clear that the love Maximus had for his son wasn't the only thing that had changed. His love for Isabella had transformed into something deeper, something more sacred. One evening, as they sat in the garden watching the sun set, Maximus took Isabella's hand in his eyes intense. "I never thought I'd find someone like you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I never thought I'd find someone who could see me for who I really am, someone who could love me despite everything." Isabella's heart fluttered at his words. This wasn't just about the medical fraud anymore, or the scandal that had brought them together. It was about two people, broken in their own ways, coming together to heal. "I didn't expect this either," Isabella whispered, her gaze soft as she looked up at him. "But I believe in us. I believe in what we can build together." Maximus smiled, a rare, genuine smile that reached his eyes. He had spent so long hiding behind his wealth, his power, his empire. But now, with Isabella by his side, he felt complete. For the first time in years, he wasn't trying to prove anything to the world. He was simply living in the truth of his love for her and for his son. Before the story reaches its conclusion, Maximus looks directly into the camera, his voice calm but full of conviction. In life, we all face challenges, but it's how we rise above them, how we choose to love and fight for what's right, that defines us. Trust is everything. Love is everything. If you believe in second chances and forgiveness and in the power of love, like, share, and subscribe for more stories of transformation and redemption.